Hello, hello. Thank you everybody for being here today. Today we're lucky enough to get to speak with Amelia Vergara, the author of La Belle Famille. And I have to say, I don't get to read too much historical fiction, especially in the indie space. And it was such a breath of fresh air when we received your submission because this isn't an era I would ever find myself getting a chance to read about. And you wrote it in such a way where it was so easy to get lost in and feel like it almost felt like it was world building, but it's based on a real situation. And it was so gripping, the way you shifted perspectives and everything. It really felt like you were there. So hats off. We absolutely loved it.
Thank you.
It was from the first page where Adam's trying to steal a drink from his captain and stuff. I've had hangovers like Adam, and I immediately knew from the style of the writing and everything. I was like, oh, I'm going to enjoy this. And I didn't expect to enjoy it quite as much as I did. I was gripped by this. When I look back at my notes that I took when I was writing it, I kept writing that I felt breathless at points. Especially, I don't want to dive right into spoilers, but there's sections with Sophie and her baby, and God, especially as you get towards the end and everything, where I was just like, oh, this is never going to end well. This is everything's going to be terrible. I was gripped the whole way through it. Absolutely loved it.
Well, that's awesome. Almost surprised to hear that, but like that's great.
I was struck by how, like, I know I read the acknowledgements at the back and everything, so I know that you've got experience. You work in medicine. I know, is it your husband speaks French or
Mhm.
all these things? Because reading through it, I couldn't help but think, how on earth, like, so much research must have went into this. I think that's where I'd like to start because it doesn't require spoiler warnings. Is like, where did this come from, and how much work did you put into getting all the details right? Because God, it's so detailed.
So I think my inspiration was like initially just an idea of like characters carrying a message like across enemy lines, and then I was like, I don't know where to put this. I'm gonna look up different battles and see if I could kind of work this sort of story that I have in my head into a historical setting. And I found this battle, which turned out to be very pivotal. So I was researching a lot about the battle, and I was like, I think this setting would work really well, because they don't know exactly how the message got through. So I could make my fictional characters do that. But and then once I kind of had a setting and I kind of had the characters, I kind of had the idea, then there was a lot more research. This was like the main book that I
Oh,
used.
amazing.
Like, it's very detailed about like everything that builds up to the battle. So it's from like Fort Niagara. I don't know, it has like every like play by play moment. And so I was like in that book all the time. And even as I was editing, I was like, oh, wait a minute, let me check the book again. That's not quite right. I've got to like adjust to this battle scene a little bit.
I think it's really telling because I remember at the very beginning of the story, you emphasize that this is a work of fiction, but it's very much the case of this, for all we know, this could have happened. Like these people might not have existed in exactly how they're written, but it showing us that book just now, it really goes to show how much research went into this. So it is nice when you have a historical fiction that's really entirely based on the history of it.
Yeah, I try to keep it as close as possible. Like, I think historical fiction has world building in it because it's not a fantasy setting, but it's a setting that's sort of foreign to us, and so we have to build it for the reader, like make them feel like they're there and live in that moment as much as I can do that.
And like I know we when we first brought you on, we kind of spoke you and I about the native languages and everything. Can you just remind us how did you go about researching that, or do you speak, or yeah.
No, not at all. So I did get a lot of different books out. There's a lot of old books that I found that had like different little snippets and different things that were written down, but at the end of the day like I still wasn't sure if those books were correct. So I had to get a native speaker to help kind of fact check all those and make sure that they were accurate, which was very difficult to like find someone who speaks that language. Unfortunately, there's very few people, so I had to find someone, and obviously paid them for their services, but it was like it was difficult to find someone to kind of check those, but very important, I thought, to like not put like nonsense in there.
the good thing, I suppose, is that if there's no one really, or it's not spoken so often now that there's no one to check it, there's no one to pull you up. Say that's wrong.
There you go. Ethically fraught, but yes,
Yeah, yeah.
there is
Ethically, we
that.
want to avoid that, but there was of the languages that I do know. So I know Ryan speaks French. I speak a tiny, tiny bit of French and just enough German to be able to figure out what they were saying most of the time without needing a translation. So, like when they're swearing at their horses and calling each other idiots and stuff, and shouting for help or shouting for stop. I think it was early on. It's Lidia, obviously, who's German, and she said something. I was like, oh, she said like "stop, pig," and I was like, yeah, I got that. I get it. And then later on, when they're talking about, it says something about loop. And I was like, oh, that's French for wolf. And then they get attacked by wolves. So I felt like I had a little kind of cheat code in to see what was coming. But I know that you had help with that as well, right?
hmm Yeah, definitely. I don't speak French and I don't speak German, so I had to. My husband speaks French, so he could help me with those. But the German, I had to find somebody as well to help with. But I tried, and I don't know how successful I was, but I was trying to put the language bits in there in such a way that, like, almost from context, you kind of know what they
Yeah.
would be saying, so you can kind of read it a little more fluidly and just keep going. But I figure nowadays, if people really want to know, they just put Google Translate on there and hold it over it, and then they know. So,
Well,
Well, I've heard before of. Sorry, Ryan, you
I was
go.
just gonna say I was gonna follow up and say exactly that. You could kind of, based on the context of the sentence or the paragraph or what was going on, it was nice that you didn't have to go and Google it or this or that. It was pretty much given, which is always a good thing when you're reading translations or when there's new words involved.
Well, it also helped because there's a lot of characters. Well, there's not loads of characters, but there's a lot of characters speaking different languages or speaking in languages that they don't understand with each other. I feel like it almost helped tie together some of the dialogues and frantic moments and stuff where I was like, oh, that's Lydia speaking because that's German. Like I don't need to be checking. So it helped it flow, if anything more. I really that was maybe one of my apart from spoilers we'll get into, one of my favorite things about it was, and it's something that's not touched on as much in like colonial era kind of historical fiction, is just how many different countries were there, like how many different people there were, different languages, different cultures, even like Lydia's from one type of settler. Other people are from different types of really religious settlers and stuff. There was a lot of that going through. I feel like it felt like reading a fantasy novel. Like if you changed the names to fictional names, I'd be like, God, this is so richly developed.
yeah, that's kind of what I was going for. And when I was researching it, just kind of finding all the different cultures that were there in the beginning. Like it's a very, very multicultural country, and it was at the beginning. So it just kind of remains so.
Yeah, I
It
think
was.
I was just gonna say
On you go, man.
one of the things that really made this stand out to me for the weirdest reason was basically I was I went to Niagara Falls over the summer and I like it was by the time I got back that I received the submission. I was like, oh, I can kind of picture this. This is quite neat. Um, but yeah, it's nice to be able to kind of pinpoint because, like you said, it's a very culturally diverse place, and it's always been, for lack of a better word.
There was, oh, what was it that I wanted to touch on? So I'm looking through my notes for things that aren't spoilers because most of the things that I want to talk about are spoilers, but it's a real pet peeve of mine if I read historical fiction that kind of papers over the horrors. Historical fiction's maybe got more horrors in it than you would think. And, there's a lot to be said about human history, human nature and stuff, the horrors that we inflict upon each other. I was really pleasantly surprised that this pulled zero punches. There's like some of the things that I've read about happening in like early colonial America. I think all of them were pretty well represented. All the
Mhm.
different horrors that humans inflict upon one another, including with infants and children and stuff. And we'll get to the infant. We'll get to Will and Sophie's child in a bit when we do the spoiler warning. But the other aspect of the historical setting that I really wanted to dive into with you was the medical aspect of it, given that I know you've got a background in it. So was it a lot of fun going into research and like what medicine would have been like back then?
It was, and especially some of the things which I don't get into too much like gore about what things, or at least I don't think I did. Maybe I've forgotten. But I trying to like keep my medical knowledge a little bit out of it and trying to be more like in line with what people would think and do back then. Some of the interesting stuff that I found was stuff about the Oneida Nation using this particular mushroom to like help stop bleeding. I was like, that's really cool. So I kind of incorporated that in because I figured that Sophie would know that if she grew up among the Oneida people. So that kind of stuff too, like I really enjoyed researching the medical stuff. But sometimes for me, it's a little hard to like not be too like 21st century medical stuff, like with withdrawal. Like they didn't necessarily know, they didn't use that term, but it still happened. So when a
Okay.
dog goes through
Yeah.
withdrawal, it's like it's exactly what would happen, but I couldn't really call it withdrawal because they wouldn't have used that term. They wouldn't have known it like that. So.
That's a good point.
Yeah, I was laughing when Adam's going through like delirium tremens or something, and the doctor's like, he's got, the falling over sickness or something. Or is it Lydia that says it, or Sophie that says it to him? It's one of them. And I was like, oh, bless, they have no idea.
I I have a like obviously the story kind of fluctuates between Adam, Sophie, and Lydia. Was there ever a point where you were considering what's the word I'm looking for? Where you were if you were considering I apologize if I butchered this Legneri
Uh-huh.
as like a main protagonist.
Um, Not really. I always kind of wanted to have him seen from the outside. Like he's a very pivotal character, but I wanted people to see him from the outside and not necessarily from a deeper inner perspective. And I kind of wanted to keep the perspectives of these fictional characters and not go too much into the minds of like actual real people. And maybe that's just because I'm scared to do that. Don't want to mess it up. But
That's fair.
That's cool. I think it was really neat that in a story about a battle, none of the POV characters were in the military. They were all, they were feeling the effects of it. But I thought that was refreshing because the battle is something just like horrifying and chaotic that we're almost on the outskirts of or in the build up to. While we're talking about the build up to the battle, the dates at the start of the chapters felt like a countdown to just something absolutely awful
Yeah.
happening,
Yeah,
which I really loved as well. And I was waiting for the title drop because La Belle Famille. I was like, oh, that's cool. Maybe it's the characters all coming together or something. I wonder when or if we'll get a title drop. Saving it for like the last paragraph, the last two paragraphs. I looked a little like when I saw it, I went, there it is, man. We got the title drop in. Is that a real place then? La Belle Famille, the meadow.
yeah, it is, and it's just like a meadow. There's like nothing there, and they don't really know why it was called that, but it was a place that was like called that. There were a couple different theories that I read about that it was maybe a place where Native Americans would go for like a sort of camping and hunting there. And so the French people would then call it La Belle Famille because it's like a family sort of hunting camp. Or there was like maybe a formation of like a wood formation of that looked or resembled like the Holy Family, so they called it that. But
All right, yeah.
nobody really knows why they call it that.
I guess we have a whole book explaining it now, which is quite nice. But I've seen you've also written, is it, I apologize, is it Firefax?
Firefax.
Firefax. Uh,
Firefax.
so historical fiction seems to be your bread and butter with this. Is it, is there any particular reason why historical fiction always stood out? Or did it always stand out?
I think it's just that I like writing historical fiction, and I've also done a little bit of fantasy that we'll see if I ever fix it up and publish it. But like I just enjoy historical fiction. I always loved it as a kid. It's like it's escaping into a different time where there were no like devices and cell phones and things like that. It's just like a escapism, I think, for me. Like I like writing in a time period that's not today, that doesn't have all this sort of other hustle and bustle, but has different problems.
No.
It certainly has different problems. It felt to me at times a bit like The Revenant, if you've ever seen it. Like kind of like early colonial America. Like, I'm a big Dungeons and Dragons fan, and I was a huge fan of how many just random wolf encounters and like mountain lion encounters and stuff were in the book. I was like, this feels like a fantasy adventure, but it's a real thing. But yeah, I absolutely loved it. We had a Ryan and I had a serious discussion about because I think you sent us Firefax as well, right?
I think I did like a long time ago, but it was too long. Like it's not in the page
Yeah.
length.
So I was like, if we could fit Firefax in, oh god, I really love a story about a boat, but
We,
I'll
I
take a story about early colonial America just the same. There's not enough good boat books out there.
was gonna say it
And
is
then
hard to find that iconic pirate story. Um, but it was really cool how you had the kind of the relationship between the characters progress over time, and then you have because you get each different perspective. Like what really stood out was specifically like Adam's dad and how he's viewed from different in a different light based on who is speaking about him. And I thought that that was a really kind of clever touch there. Because when Adam's speaking about him, it's one thing, but when Sophie or Lydia is, it's another. And you see that kind of that troubled. I don't know how I want to phrase this, but like that kind of troubled individual where like he has his responsibility, but like he's in a tough spot. Like at the end of the day, I ended up like sympathizing. I felt bad for the guy. Like, well, what could you do with in that point?
Yeah, I also felt bad for him.
the last thing I'd like to touch on before we get into spoilers was more about because we spoke a lot about the history and everything, but what really took me as well was the writing style, the voice, the prose. I thought it was beautifully written. And I wanted to ask if this was like one of the first things that you'd written, if it's later on that you'd written it, or like where you got your kind of style and your inspiration for how you write, I guess.
Yeah. I think like I kind of started writing like in like Firefax is one that I wrote first when I was in high school, and then I just put it in a drawer and I didn't take it out until like 2021 when I was kind of just, I don't know, being doused in horror at the hospital and I just needed that escapism. Like it was so bad during COVID in the hospital. So I was like just
Oh yeah.
writing to like escape it and I had done some writing before that, like stuff that I wasn't gonna publish. Like I have like a quite a long fantasy story that's very long that I have just also sitting in a drawer. Maybe in 15 years I'll take it out and fix it and publish it. But I think I don't know. I get a lot of inspiration from things that I read, like as a young person. Like I grew up with like Redwall and Lord of the
Oh
Rings
yeah.
I've read Redwall,
all
yeah.
that kind of stuff. I feel like Redwall is like a big influence on me. There's a lot of action. Things are always
A lot of
happening.
brutality.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh,
A lot of animal violence,
yep.
But Redwall pulled no punches either. That
Yeah.
was you had your moments where it's like, is this written for kids? Like,
Yeah. I read it one of the books not that long ago. I was like, this doesn't seem like it's written for kids. There's so much violence.
Redwall's horrifying. Watership Down's one of my favorite books ever, and it was the
Oh,
same. I read it when I was young, and I was like, I'm gonna have nightmares about these rabbits, man. This is a horror film.
I
that
love Watership
No,
Down.
absolutely
I
love
that's
it.
read
one
that like almost every year. I read Watership Down over
Oh,
again. It's
that's
such a
one I
it's
still
my
haven't
favorite.
read,
Honestly, I
and
love
I
it.
know I'd enjoy it.
Oh, it's great, man. Those rabbits will break your heart. Honestly,
yeah.
it's so good.
So I've been told. Um, but yes, Steve, now's your favorite part, spoilers. Uh,
Yes, give me
you
the
made it
spoilers.
20 minutes into the interview about a book you haven't read yet. Just go read the book and then come back. Um, but yeah,
It's a
Steve,
good read, quick read. Took me 2 days. Sped
yeah,
through it. Real good read.
that was the other side of this. Is like because you send in like this was a submission. I'm just reading a manuscript on my computer, which is by no means the most enjoyable way to read. And I think it really says something when, as I'm reading a manuscript on my computer, I'm able to tear through it in 2 or 3 sittings because it really was gripping. Like you're sitting there being like, even though it was switching from perspective to perspective, it never like went from Adam to Lydia's perspective, and then I kind of skimmed through to be like, okay, I want to get back to Adam. Like I felt every perspective really held up on its own, which was quite nice.
Good. I think the hardest one to like keep things like going and intense is like Sophie when she's alone. But I felt like
Mhm.
some of those chapters were like the most intense because she's just by herself. She's not interacting with anyone else. But it was still, I s- hopefully hopefully able to keep it still keep the reader invested.
I mean, you
So
definitely
Sophie's
trust
chapters for me were the yeah, Sophie's chapters were the ones that really I wrote in my notes. I just wrote, "This is heavy, man," because it was heavy. Just the infant mortality in historical novels is not always addressed fully. But the minute I read, "Oh, she's the baby's got a fever," I went, "Ah, oh no, that baby ain't going to see the title credits at the end."
that was
But then,
my thinking as well because like the whole Oregon Trail, like you have died of dysentery kind of thing. It's like like the moment something small happens,
oh man,
it is gonna turn.
yeah, and I was the exact same. I was just waiting for something to go horribly wrong, which made it even better when at the end, it all kind of it works out. Obviously, like it's not without suffering that they get there. Speaking of getting towards the ending as well, I wrote down that you should package a drinking game where every time Sophie has to explain that she's Will's wife, you have to take a drink. So when she gets to the fortress, everyone's like, "Who are you?" It's like, "Yeah, I'm Sophie. I'm Will Light's wife." And then every time she said it after that, I was like, "Oh mate, it's like going through customer service, to get into the fortress." Uh, even just when they got to Will, and so I wrote this down as well because I thought this was worth telling you. When Will and Sophie reunited again, I think that's one of the best kisses I've ever read in a story. And then I thought, wow, right, I'll need to give Amelia the award for best kiss in a novel that I've read this year. And then it happened again near the end, when Lydia has to
Yeah.
pretend that Adam's her
Yeah.
husband. And I was like, she'd done it again. I'm not going to ask about the research for that, obviously, but
My husband helped a little bit.
I was gonna say though, that being said, I did not have any faith that Will was gonna be alive at the end of it. I was going into this being like, oh no, this poor Sophie is not gonna enjoy what's about to happen. But it was really nice that it kind of broke away from what I expected. It still caught me off guard. It ended up being like a lighthearted kind of thing. Obviously we get the death, and I think it was done in a really, really nice way because he was a very, very troubled man, and I feel like that was the only way to ease his own suffering with everything, for lack of a better word.
just get shot.
Like, stop.
I
Was
there you go.
I was just gonna say, was that relationship between him and Adam always going to be contentious, like from the get-go of the story?
Yes, I think from the time that I envisioned Adam and I realized like how he was going to be connected, like I knew that there was going to be strife, and then like when I thought about it and obviously researched, and I was like, he deserted, like he's going to need to be executed, like there's really no other way back then, and just hang the people. So, and then having his father be the captain, I don't know, it was going to be a lot of tension.
Speaking of tension, I'd made a little note in my file when I was reading that just says, "Brave local woman travels like 200 miles to have an argument with her husband." Like when she gets to the fortress,
Like
she's
good.
like,
I could use that in marketing.
I told my wife about that. She said, "Yeah, I'd do the same thing." I'd walk across North America in the colonial era just to tell you that you're
Just
an
to be
idiot.
like, oh.
I really love that. So, like, I know that you've got those two books out. What kind of other stuff are you working on? Something at the minute, or
Yeah, I have like a couple things in the works. I have like working on a sequel to Firefax, and that I think we're on the second draft now, so it's coming along. And then I have this Western that I've written that's very close to being ready to publish. And I don't know why I wrote a Western, but it's historical fiction. I like Westerns. They're
That's so exciting.
kind of fun. And then I have another one set during the like colonial period that I just started recently, so that'll be a while yet. But there's kind of like three things in the works at the moment.
Nice.
many irons in the fire? Like, where do your ideas come from then? Like three on the go at once is pretty impressive already. But yeah, where's that coming from?
Good question. I don't know. I find inspiration in a lot of things, and I think sometimes I find it like in interactions with patients where like you'll see something very poignant happening and you're like, wow. and then suddenly your writer brain kind of kicks on, or something like it can be something very random that kind of kicks you into, I don't know, wanting to write, I feel like. And you're a writer too, right? So like,
Yeah,
seems
it's really
like
dangerous for me to watch anything, read
yeah,
anything,
yeah,
get ideas for
yeah.
stuff.
Like a really powerful show or movie, you'll be like, oh, and then you'll start cooking.
Yeah, when I was reading La Belle Famille, I was like, God, I should really do something set in, like something that's, that, like you said, the idea of a messenger trying to get something across enemy lines. And I went back to, what was it, 1917, that World War One film where the guys
Oh
just got
yeah.
to get a message
Yeah.
across even enemy lines, just like no man's land, and it's just hellish.
Yeah.
I thought this reminded me a little bit of that, obviously in a really, that kind of crossed with The Revenant, I guess. But I'm a huge fan of like muskets and flintlock stuff and bayonet, like Civil War stuff,
Hmm.
British Empire battles and stuff. I was obsessed with musket lines when I was young. So I was like, why aren't they just standing in a line shooting each other? Man, this is brutal.
I
But I
still
really,
don't
I love
understand
sharp and stuff growing up. Yeah. I
Yep.
loved all that kind of stuff. So it's dangerous to watch anything that evokes like a strong emotion, I think. The
Yep.
writer brain, like you said, to start.
Yeah, I feel like historical fiction is not as well represented in the like indie space. I don't know. Maybe it is and I just don't know. Maybe it's just like quiet and I just don't see it, but I see like a
I
lot
think
more fantasy and sci-fi in the indie space. So I've it's kind of a niche. So I feel like there's a lot of space for
well,
historical fiction in the
I
indie.
completely agree. Obviously, Steve, you read a little bit more than I do, but I will have to say, from what I've seen and whatnot, obviously the amount of work that you put in to make this book a reality, I think when you're indie publishing, you're already doing so much that going back and having to research is just another kind of step, another obstacle. So yeah, I think you're right. There is very much a space for it, but I think it takes a very dedicated individual to making it happen, and you've done it in such a nice way. But yeah, I think the indie space it's a lot of fantasy. You get a lot of sci-fi. You get a lot of stuff where people can really branch out with their creativity completely uninhibited.
Sure.
it's interesting as well. I very recently went through a massive tranche of like fantasy novels that I'd picked up from Spiffbo, self-published fantasy blog off.
Oh
So
yeah.
it's 10th year, I think. And the first thing that I do when I'm kind of filtering through stuff that I've found on the internet is to eliminate all the books that are more than 350 pages long, obviously. And that was about 90% of them because everyone who writes a fantasy novel, guilty as charged myself, everyone writes a fantasy novel that's 200,000 words long. And that's the first book of a trilogy, if not more, because everybody wants to be Robert Jordan, everybody wants to be J.R. Tolkien. And I can't blame them, so they are. But it's definitely much more niche. We've had a real thing trying to find westerns, ship books, anything historical fiction. So it was a really, really pleasant surprise to get this dropped into the submissions box. I remember, I think a while back, I put a post up on Twitter saying, if you're a sci-fi author, send me your books. 200 replies. If you're a crime or a thriller author, send me your books. 50 replies. And then I asked for historical fiction. I got about 10.
Oh no.
Which is a good measure, I think, of because usually people jump on those threads, so it's usually a good measure of how many's out there. If I ask for fantasy books, I'll probably cost Elon Musk quite a fair bit in electricity bills just hosting the images
Yep.
because there's a lot of them.
No, there are. It seems to be fantasy, romance, and sci-fi seem to be the most popular kind of genres there.
Absolutely. So when it comes to reading books yourself, do you tend towards reading histofic as well, or do you like to go for other stuff?
I read a lot of historical fiction and I like fantasy. I was also kind of following the SBFBX. And then
Oh yeah.
yeah, it's good books this year. Wish I had more time. And then so mostly historical fiction and fantasy is what I read. And then I'll occasionally dip into like a thriller here and there. Don't really read a lot of romance, but um Yeah, I just don't. I read a lot of nonfiction too, like different books about like nature things and stuff like
Oh
that
yeah.
that I enjoy.
I feel like romance is such a versatile genre in that I know personally I don't like to just read a straight romance novel, but it seems to it plays a theme in a lot of stories. Like La Belle Famille had a good romance, and I think romance in itself could be such a polarizing genre for people. Like, no, I'm not going to read romance or this or that. But I feel like most people appreciate it when it plays a role in a story in any capacity.
Yep, yep. It's kind of a universal thing. Everybody wants love, so
There you
in any
go.
Yeah.
setting.
I guess you can always just sprinkle it in there. I feel like La Belle Famille done really well with its romances. It never felt forced or anything. Uh, but it was you still got those little kind of little like, fairy tale romancing moments in, especially during. See, this is maybe a thing that's personal to me. Two people falling in love, cool, that's nice. Two people falling in love, but someone's shooting at them. Oh, I'm there. That's brilliant.
I was gonna say, I feel like Adam and Lydia had the world's worst first date.
Yeah.
Based on the ones I've heard, I can't think of it getting much worse than that. But,
I don't
but
know, man.
yeah,
I've had some bad ones. I'm not
yeah.
being flip no,
But
but
it
that's
was one of
definitely
those
a thing.
things where even after that, you were able to make it so that it didn't necessarily feel like a forced relationship. And you only have like 250, 300 pages to present that. And I think that's what makes it really nice is that even when it goes from the absolute worst possible beginning, you can still completely turn the page, which is always nice.
Yeah, they had quite a turnaround.
So
So,
I'm
Ryan, before I go off topic, do you have any of the reader questions or anything there that
the
we've
the
missed out?
reader questions were about Legneri, and
That's me.
if perspectives were if it was ever a question of sharing his perspective as well, but we got that answer.
Cool. I'll ramble off topic then. So, Amelia, you're following Spiffbox this year. How have you? Is this your first year following it, and how are you finding it?
Yeah, it really is my first year of following it, and I feel like I haven't had like I want to read all the finalists. I was reading like books during it. There was one that I really liked, and that was called Temper the Dark. It was about like a dragon riding girl. A little it was really cool, and it was a YA fan like which usually I don't like to read YA, but I love this book. And then now I want to read like all the finalists, but they're all pretty long. And I don't have that much
That's
time.
funny. I feel because I went through them all,
Yeah.
I've got this like latent mind palace thing going on now where I recognize Temper of the Dark. That's the one with the big dark dragon on the front of it, right?
Yeah.
Yep, I've seen them all. So that one was way
Oh.
too big. That got
Yeah,
cut
I
pretty
have
quick.
like still a list of them that I'm like, I'm gonna read these sometime soon, maybe.
Well, that's the
Yeah.
beauty of books is that they'll always be there.
Yep.
It doesn't like even as somebody like Steve and I read a lot, and I can say firsthand, I wish I had more time to, because ever since starting YPQ, I haven't really read for pleasure. And like I'm grateful that this means I do get to read for pleasure, but my TBR continues to stack. I'm like, oh, I'll get to it. I've got other more pressing stories to read. But on that note, we have 3 minutes left on the timer. So I want to make sure that readers can find you, this and that. So obviously, this was La Belle Famille. If readers
Mhm.
like the story, what's the best way they can get a hold of you, follow up, see what you're working on?
Yeah, so I have a website that I don't update that often, but it's amvergara.com, so it's pretty simple to find. And then I have a Substack that I also don't update very often, but occasionally I'll send something out, like if I have a new release or if I have like some musings or something about a book that I read. So I update the Substack occasionally, and those are kind of really the two ways of getting like a hold of me. And through the Substack, you can always message me.
And if they like La Belle Famille, Firefax next.
Yeah, they should read it. It's a little different. It
Give
also
us the
has like
elevator
kind of
pitch. What's the elevator pitch for
complicated
Firefox?
family dynamics and a lot of violence. And I don't know. It's a fun book. I enjoyed writing it. It was my escape during COVID, so I loved writing it. But it's like a little it feels, I think it's written a little bit more like fantasy than like historical fiction. So and yeah, but they would probably like it if they liked La Belle Famille.
Steve, you've got 90 seconds if you have any of is was it deliberate?
Oh, I've already asked all my deliberate questions. I want to ask Amelia what her favorite book set on a boat is that isn't Firefax so that I can go and read it.
Ooh, my favorite book, like in general.
Boat, no, boat based books,
Oh,
naval
boat-based
books.
book. Ah, oh.
That's tough.
And you can't say Master and Commander.
I know I was gonna say that. I read all those and loved
Oh, they're
them.
great, aren't they? Yeah, they're brilliant.
Oh, what else besides that one? I
I'll
mean,
also accept any because I can't find any most of the time, apart from the Master and Commander books. No.
I think if there's another good one, um, The Adventures of hold on, how is it called? It's called The Adventures of Charlotte Doyle. I think I read this when I was young by an author called Avi, A-V-I. But I can't remember exactly what the title is. I only remember Charlotte Doyle is the in the title, and she is on a ship, and she's like a 16-year-old girl who like does a lot of really cool
I,
stuff. I really enjoyed that book. I still remember it all these years later.
Oh, time's up.
I hate to interrupt. I hate
Time's
to
up.
interrupt. We
Sorry,
got
Amelia.
8 seconds left. Thank you guys both so much for being here. La Belle Famille by Amelia Vergara. Thank you again.
Thank